Good afternoon, everyone. This is Darlene with Generations Health. Thank you so much for joining us for our program, Promises in Caregiving, Why You Shouldn't Make Them and How to Undo Them, presented by Jennifer Fitzpatrick. We are so grateful to have Artis Senior Living of Chestnut Ridge sponsoring today's program. And in just a couple minutes, I'm going to invite Patty Pelican to join me. But first, there's a couple things I need to cover with you. The first is everyone is going to be muted, and that is simply to eliminate any background noise. However, this is an interactive program, so we do encourage your participation. And so if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, if you're answering any questions that Jen may ask, or if you have comments about the discussion that is taking place, please feel free to utilize the chat feature. As a reminder, to find chat, if you scroll across the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little banner that pops up, and on that there's a bubble that says chat. When you click on that, that's going to launch the chat feature, and it will most likely pull up on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, when you use chat with us today, your questions, comments, answers, those are only going to be seen by Patty, Jennifer, and myself, and that is simply for privacy reasons. But Jen is fabulous about being able to go through those chat messages and answer questions that you have and incorporate your comments that you have into her program as well. So please feel free to communicate with us that way. Also, at the end of the program, I'm going to put a link into the chat box, and that's going to be for a very quick evaluation, and we hope that you will take that after today's program. All right, as I mentioned, we are so grateful to have Artis Senior Living of Chestnut Ridge sponsoring today's program, and I would like to invite Patty Pelican to unmute herself and get on the screen with me here to share some information with you about Artis. Patty?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining our program today. I want to tell you a little bit about Artis Senior Living. We provide memory care for people living with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia and cognitive decline. Through our mission of compassionate, individualized care, our associates, residents, and their families join together to create a haven of dignity, empowerment, well-being, and comfort. The Artis philosophy is about human care versus memory care. And oftentimes when memory care is the focus, it becomes about the negatives of the disease and the limitations. And when you focus on caring for the human being, you focus on their needs, their abilities, their possibilities, and their uniqueness. The A in Artis stands for the ability to have a voice. Our residents have the opportunity to vote and have a say on things that matter to them. For example, at the monthly town hall meetings, residents have the opportunity to meet with leadership and to have a voice in what they would like to see happening in the community in which they live. R is for respecting and maintaining relationships. We honor and recognize that our residents are so much more than dementia patients, quote unquote, and our associates are more than just employees of Artis Senior Living. T is for treasuring each person's uniqueness. We have a position at Artis Senior Living entitled the Director of Artis Way Experience. This team member is the keeper of the philosophy and ensures that each department is providing the services with the residents' interest first and foremost. And the I is for integrity. This is truly a cornerstone of what Artis is about. We simply understand that we must do the right thing by the residents and their families. And S is for success and recognition. You know, everyone wants to feel as though they did something well, and people want to be recognized for a job well done. We strive every day to give that sense, not only to our residents, but also to their families and to our associates as well. We're really looking forward to this program, and I'd like to turn it back over to you, Darlene.
Great, thank you so much, Patty. And again, thank you so much for sponsoring today's program. All right, are you stressed? Are you a stressed out caregiver? Have you made a promise to your loved one that you aren't sure you can keep? If you answered yes to either question, you are in the right place. Our presenter today is the author of Cruising Through Caregiving, Reducing the Stress of Caring for Your Loved One, and a longtime gerontology instructor at Johns Hopkins University's Certificate on Aging program. She is one of less than 800 certified speaking professionals worldwide and has been featured in national media such as The Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, U.S. News and World Report, CBS, ABC, and many more. When she's not working, she spends her time fantasizing about when she will be able to wander the aisles of TJ Maxx and Marshalls without a mask. Please join me in welcoming from Kent Island, Maryland, Jennifer Fitzpatrick.
I promise, I swear, I'll never. When I hear these phrases from a family caregiver, I know I'm in for a really emotional conversation. I'm sure that Patty and Rebecca, who work with Artist Senior Living, have heard those phrases from family caregivers many, many times. And many of you have possibly uttered those phrases. And what that often is leading to is a conversation that the family caregiver, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a daughter, whether it's a nephew, a son-in-law, might say, well, we promised that we're never going to bring dad to an assisted living, or we swore we would never bring help into the home, or we told her we would never ever sell her house. And these promises, I wrote a whole chapter in my book, Cruising Through Caregiving, about these promises. And these promises are very much well-meaning by people who are trying to do the best that they can for their loved one. Again, daughters and sons and nieces, nephews, grandkids, spouses especially. If you've made such a promise, we'd love to hear from you in the chat section. If you would tell us a little bit about what kind of promise you made and to whom, we would love to hear your comments. But these promises happen every single day. And I think a lot of people think, well, it's a unique situation that you might not understand, that I felt that I had to make such promises. A lot of people, maybe spouses, will cite that they need to make the promise because they made wedding vows. They made a commitment to their loved one. Other people might have made a commitment. I've heard of so many scenarios where adult kids have made promises on deathbeds to parents about what they're going to do for the other parent to make sure that they're well taken care of. And so nobody goes into making a promise that they maybe are going to have a hard time keeping. But a lot of us, especially in dementia caregiving, these promises can be very difficult to keep. So what we want is to reshape a promise. We want to try to pull back. If you have not made a promise yet, we want you to be really careful about making a promise. We want you to be really careful about being specific about what you're telling your loved one you will or won't do in order to help them or to provide care. Because sometimes some promises should just never be made. And in dementia caregiving, which many of us happen to believe is the most challenging caregiving, these promises happen very regularly. Perhaps one of the first family caregivers that was public about caregiving for a public figure was former First Lady Nancy Reagan. And of course, she took care of President Reagan, who suffered with Alzheimer's disease. And Mrs. Reagan did so many wonderful things to advance Alzheimer's awareness. She did a lot of advocacy. She was all about talking about research. And she spoke openly about caregiving for President Reagan. And she was famously interviewed, and I write about this in Cruising Through Caregiving. She was famously interviewed by Larry King, and she said that she would never place her husband in any kind of community, senior living, nursing home, that just would never happen, that he would remain at their Bel Air, California home. And that's where he remained. This is back a while ago, before a lot of people were talking about Alzheimer's, and I do believe that this set a tone for a lot of the way many in our nation have looked at Alzheimer's care, that the right thing to do is do it all yourself, keep the person at home, that it would be, I think at one point Mrs. Reagan talked about that she really didn't want anybody to see the president, not himself, not the way that he would want to be remembered. And I think that that got into a lot of people's heads, and a lot of folks, especially our older generations, have sort of carried that around. In a lot of families, what's done in that family is that everyone takes care of the older generations, and we do everything we can to keep from needing help, whether it be help in the home, whether it be adult day, whether it be senior living like artists. So as much good as Nancy Reagan did put in a lot of people's minds that the best way or the right way to take care of somebody was at home. But Mrs. Reagan had a lot of resources that probably many of us do not. And if you can share with us what you think that is in the chat section, I'll give a moment. If everybody would maybe write in the chat section, if you have an idea of what maybe Mrs. Reagan and Mr. Reagan had that many of us don't have, we would love to hear from you. And in fact, the first person that writes in, we're going to send you a free copy of Cruising Through Caregiving. Whether if you want a Kindle version, we'll give that to you. Or if you prefer to have a hard copy, we'll send that to you. But I want everybody to take a moment. First person that writes in a good answer, we're gonna give you a free copy of Cruising Through Caregiving. So I'm gonna wait and hear from you. Just give you all a few moments to write in. Okay, so Patty, you said something great, financial resources. So Patty with Artist said financial. She's got a lot of financial resources that maybe some others don't have. But there's actually something that I'm thinking about a little bit more in detail. Something that many of us do have financial resources. We can afford senior living, we can afford help in the home, but there's something that the Reagans had that most of us will never have access to, even if we have financial resources. And I'll give another moment to see if anybody writes in. What I'm thinking about is the Secret Service. And so, as probably many of you know, persons with Alzheimer's and Lewy body and frontal temporal dementia, vascular dementia, tend to wander. And it's really hard to keep your eyes on that person all the time. But guess what the Reagans had at their home? They had the Secret Service. And I'm guessing that if President Reagan tried to wander out of his Bel Air, California home, that's probably who redirected him and stopped him. Most of us are never going to have that magnitude of help in the home. In addition to the Secret Service being there, they also had doctors, not just home care aides or nurses, but doctors. They had aides, they had nurses, so they had a lot of help. Most of us are just not equipped to be able to handle that long term. So what I want to remind everybody about is that there are no one way to be a good family caregiver. Most of us, I think, when we start to make promises to our loved ones or even promises to ourselves, we do it with the idea that I want to be a good family caregiver. This is the only way that I can show my love or make sure that my loved one is cared for and safe and knows that I love them. But just rest assured, there are many, many ways that you can be a good family caregiver, but also making sure that you are taken care of as well. So why do we make such promises? We sort of alluded to this a little bit ago, but a lot of families, especially spouses and couples, say, well, I made wedding vows. I made vows about why it's sickness and in health. People cite that a lot. And sickness and in health does not, however, necessarily mean that you have to promise that your loved one will stay at home forever. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do every task, make their food, get their medicine, take them to the doctor, help them in the bathroom, chase them outside if they wander out of your home. So for a lot of families, the vows are taken to an extreme, that the belief is that sickness and in health, if I'm taking that seriously, I got to do it all. And when we believe that, a lot of us seem that we are in what we call martyr syndrome, that we're trying to do everything. Emotion, So for a lot of families, it's an emotional vow that we make. Maybe not a marital vow, but an emotional vow. So I have a friend who's, when her dad died, she made all sorts of promises about what she would do for her mom to her father. And it was made at a very emotional moment when somebody is at the end of life and we start promising what we're going to do and who we're going to take care of and how. That's very, very emotional time. And so sometimes we're not always thinking it all through. Our sentiment is there, but can we really keep such a promise? Culturally, and in many families, it's simply the way something is done in your family that you're going to promise that we're not going to bring strangers into the home. But many different cultures have certain ways that they want to provide caregiving. Now, for many, many generations in many cultures, a lot of times females, women in the family didn't work as frequently. And so the expectation was that they're going to take care of kids, they're going to take care of the aging grandparents, the aging parents, and that would just be what their role would be, that women in the family would do that. And in many cultures, that is still expected, even though a lot of the females in the family are working. Yeah. Marilyn says she thinks Nancy Reagan had some help. Very true. Absolutely. The Secret Service, among others. Also, I think sometimes what happens to many of us is when we make a promise, we don't completely understand what we're agreeing to. So I'm going to go back to marriage for a moment. Guessing I've been married for 20 years, which for, I guess, many of you on this program, you probably will say, that's nothing. I've been married much longer than that. But I want to ask you a question. No matter how long you've been married, did you honestly understand what you were saying yes to on your wedding day, or when you proposed to your spouse, or when you got to the day of the wedding? Did you really truly grasp what you were saying yes to? So if you want to write in, I'd love to hear from you. But for the rest of us, maybe you have children. Maybe when you decided that you were going to have a child, did you really completely understand what that entailed, what you were agreeing to, the sacrifices physically, emotionally, financially, what you were agreeing to? And a lot of times when we make a decision, sometimes we don't completely understand what we're agreeing to. And this, I don't think, is more true than it is in caregiving. So, for example, if somebody is, for example, when my grandmother had surgery about many years ago, maybe 25 years ago at this point, my grandmother was in her 60s and she had broken both of her shoulders, which just was, if you can imagine, she was unable to use her arms, her hands, her shoulders, both sides. She was in a sling for 4 weeks, which seemed like a really long time. And the doctor says, okay, 4 weeks, you're not allowed to do anything for yourself. And so my aunts and I, the four of us, we made a calendar and we made sure that one of us were with her at all times. And she wanted one of us to help in the bathroom because she didn't really want it to be my grandfather. We were preparing the meals, or we were making sure we had to feed her. My grandfather would help with some items, but for a lot of it, one of us ladies did it. We understood what we were agreeing to because we knew that there was an end date. There was an end date. So 4 weeks. Now, I will tell you that I had the weekend shifts. My aunts all took time off during the week, and I was a young professional at the time. So I started my shift Friday afternoon, and I left Sunday afternoon. And I got to tell you, at the end of that approximately 48 hours, I felt like I was going to collapse because every time I got something from my grandmother, she had to go to the bathroom. She wanted to take a shower. She wanted me to bring some magazine that she wanted to look at, but then I'm going to have to flip the pages for her. Think about it. All those things that she can't do because she doesn't have the use of her appendages. That was only 4 weekends that I gave up. For many of you, if you're taking care of a loved one who has Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, you don't know how long it's going to last. It could be a year. It could be 3 years. It could be 5 years. It could be 12 or 15 or 20. And so if we're saying to a loved one, we're never going to move you, or we're never going to sell your house, or we're only going to have family take care of you, often we do not understand truly what we're agreeing to. When we knew that that 4 weeks was up, my aunts and I, we all kind of high-fived and said we got through it. My grandmother was super happy, and she went on to live many, many, many more years healthfully and happily. But most of caregiving, and especially dementia caregiving, we don't know the time frame. There's a lot of uncertainty. So feel free to write in with any comments, any questions, any examples that you would like to share as we go on. So I'm going to give you the example of the Smith family. And Henry is the person with Alzheimer's disease, and Henry is 75. Christine is his daughter, she's 45. Joe is the son-in-law, 47. And then we've got two granddaughters that are Christine and Joe's, Sarah and Liz. And Henry now has Alzheimer's disease, and Henry lives only a few blocks away, a few miles away from Chris, Joe, Sarah, and Liz. And Henry had asked, when he was first diagnosed, in the early stages, he said to his daughter and his son-in-law, I never want to move out of my house, and I don't want anybody except you two to take care of me. And so Christine and Joe said, sure, we can do that. We will make sure that we never sell your house, you never have to move, that you don't have to go anywhere. We're not going to bring any strangers. We don't want that for you. And so for the first year or so, things were going all right. But as things progressed and as Henry's situation wound up getting worse, it was harder because it was getting to the point now Christine and Joe, who both have jobs, who both work, were every evening, one of them going over to Henry's house to check in on him. Did he eat? Has he showered? What kind of shape is the house in? Has he been taking his medicine? And ultimately, as time goes on and as another year goes by, Christine and Joe decide that they're going to be, one of them is going to have to spend the night at Henry's house every night because he was a nighttime wanderer. And so both of them still had jobs. And it got to the point now where Christine and Joe were never under the same roof at the same time. One of them was always at Henry's home. Now, what do you think the repercussions were on these 5 people in this family? There were repercussions for Henry. There were repercussions for Christine, for Joe, for Liz, and for Sarah. So I'm curious, what do you think some of these repercussions are? So feel free to write in if you have any idea of what some of these repercussions might have been. So what do you think maybe was going on with the granddaughters? Well, anybody, you're very welcome to write in and share any examples that you have. But let's talk, what do you think was happening with the granddaughters? What do you think was happening with Joe and Christine? And maybe what do you think was going on with Henry? Because of the promise that Christine and Joe made, what was the repercussions? Now, here is a beautiful, simple promise that Christine and Joe made to Henry. And they felt that they were doing the right thing. They wanted to please Henry. Henry was the patriarch of the family. They loved and respected him. But as time was going on, Henry's judgment was getting worse. Henry was not only walking out of his home in the middle of the night, he started walking out of his home during the day. Now, Christine and Joe both had to work at different points. So there were a lot of hours that he was home alone. And I think that there was sort of a false sense of security going on for Christine and Joe because they thought, well, if someone's there at night, that's when all the bad things can happen. That's when a fire happens. That's when a burglary happens. That's when he might get lost and not be able to be found. But really, all of those negative things can happen during the day, and those things started to happen. They would have to call the police because Henry was missing. The 4 in the household, Christine, Joe, Liz, and Sarah, never had dinner together anymore. Both parents weren't able to go to activities for their daughter's sports. Other issues that happened were that Christine and Joe, for a period of a couple years now, aren't sleeping under the same roof ever in the marital bed. They're not able to connect with each other in that way. Perhaps most importantly, what happened with Henry is Henry was not getting the best possible care. Christine and Joe were exhausted. Christine and Joe were working. They're trying to balance parenting. Their relationship is not as solid as it once was because they're never mind sexual relations, but they're never really able to catch up for a conversation or coffee in the morning because they're constantly missing one another. So this situation was orchestrated by a promise that they made to Henry. Henry, as time went on, had less and less ability to reason and have judgment. And so a promise that they made to somebody whose reasoning and judgment ability is diminishing is impacting 5 lives. One of the girls starts to have trouble with her schoolwork. Her grades aren't as good as they once were. So a promise that you can't fulfill often is going to have negative spin-off effects to many people in the family. And so you want to be thinking about that when you make a promise. And so what ultimately wound up happening in this situation, and of course I've changed all the identifying characteristics, but when I was spending time with this family, I asked them some questions. First of all, Henry was definitely at risk, and Adult Protective Services was called because he was wandering and he was being left alone. There were times where Christine and Joe attempted to have a conversation with him and say, Dad, we really can't keep up with this. Is it okay if we look for some help to bring into your house? Or if we maybe look into moving you? And Henry would become irate and he would get mad. And sometimes he'd forget who Christine was. He would think Christine was his wife. So they're trying to have this logical, reasonable conversation with somebody whose brain doesn't work properly. And so now you see what's happening is Henry, whose brain is not working properly, who's losing judgment, losing reasoning skills, he is orchestrating life for years for 5 people. And he, in addition to Christine, Joe, Liz, and Sarah, he is also suffering because his care is not what it should be. Ultimately, Christine and Joe had to make the very painful decision of taking steps to bring help into the home. Now, if they weren't able to get Henry to sort of go along with it at one point, they probably would have had to go ahead and get guardianship. Thankfully, Henry many years prior had given power of attorney when, if he was to become incapacitated, unable to make decisions, that his daughter Christine was going to be able to make his decisions. And now she's able to make those choices so he wouldn't be home alone. She and Joe and even Liz and Sarah helped out. They still went over there. It doesn't mean that they weren't part of the plan anymore, but they had a lot of help. And then ultimately, he went into a community like an Artist Senior Living, where he was interacting with others, where there was always medical help around, somebody managing his medicines, someone making sure that he was eating healthful foods. And this gave Christine and Joe and Liz and Sarah their family back. It gave them back peace of mind. This didn't take anything away from their relationship. They visited often. They knew everything that was going on with Henry, but they knew he wasn't going to be wandering when they were at work. They couldn't afford to quit their jobs. They couldn't afford to take early retirement. And ultimately, Henry did settle in. A lot of times we assume this person made this proclamation that we're never going to move them. We're never going to bring help. We're never going to look at adult day. The person ultimately will adjust. Ultimately, what happens is if the family, Christine and Joe, if they are tense and they feel tremendous guilt, oftentimes someone like a Henry is going to pick up on that, and there's going to be even more resistance. So when you decide that, you know what, I can't keep this pace up anymore, it's not good for my physical health, my mental health, it's not good for my kids, the professionals, if you're working with the right organization, they're going to help you navigate this. They're going to help you to be able to figure out how to make the transition. It is going to take time. Okay, so questions and comments are very, very welcome. If you find yourself in the position of considering making a promise, you are very much advised to try really hard to avoid making a promise. We don't want you to make a promise that you can't keep, because what we want to do is do what we call the tandem anchor promise. And my husband and I have made this to one another, that please get all the help you can. If I have cognitive impairment, if you're not able to take care of me, just get the help that you can. I trust you to make sure that I'm in a safe place, that I'm as well taken care of as we can afford. Promise that you're going to do the best that you can, that you're going to oversee their care. In Cruising Through Caregiving, I write about the concept of the primary caregiver is like the captain of a ship, and they are in charge. And that might be, if we go back to the family of the Smith family, Christine is the captain of that ship. Joe is more like her first mate. And then friends and family, neighbors, people from their faith community, even Liz and Sarah are sort of their dock hands, people that can support. And so what we want to do is just make sure we say, we're going to do everything we can to keep you safe, to make you give you the best quality of life possible if you have health issues that require assistance. Because keeping somebody at home forever without any help, I think it's only really, for some families, they can make it work. They have tons and tons of extended family, friends, neighbors, faith community. If they have 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 people in their network that can come over and help, sometimes it can work. Or say, if you're Nancy Reagan and you've got the Secret Service and you've got full-time staff that can take care of your husband in a private home. But in a lot of cases, it just is not going to be something that can happen long-term. It's not a commitment for 4 weeks. So why do we want to undo the promise? These are some signs that maybe you want to undo the promise. Your physical and mental health are not as good as they once were. Maybe you're struggling with migraines. Maybe you're having a lot of stomach upset. If you go to cruisingthroughcaregiving.com, and I'm going to ask Darlene to put that in the chat section, you can get the first chapter of the book for free, as well as all of the worksheets. And there's a worksheet to determine if you're in the martyr syndrome, which often is because you've made a promise that you're having a hard time keeping. Not always, but often it is. But if your physical and mental health is deteriorating, maybe you're having a flare-up with depression, or your nerves are really bad, especially with all the craziness we have going on in the world right now. In particular, a lot of us are struggling even more than usual. Just aside from caregiving, all of the stressors from the pandemic and from shutdowns. So if you see your health physically, mentally slipping, it's time to consider, how can I undo the promise? Remember that it's not always good for your loved one. Think about Henry wandering around in the cold during a work day when Christine and Joe were at work. That's not good for him. Henry wasn't socializing with other people. He wasn't engaged like he would be maybe at an adult day or in an artist senior living, like a senior living community. He wasn't maybe having healthy food all the time during the day because there was no one to cook for him. So if you're saying, this is not necessarily the best thing for my loved one, this is definitely something to look at. What about your caregiving crew? So when we look at Christine, maybe Joe's having issues with his physical and mental health during this time. Maybe, like we talked about, the daughters are struggling, one with schoolwork, that they never have their whole family together at one time. So what's the top mistake in undoing a promise in dementia caregiving? I want you to be thinking about that. Now, Patty just wrote in that she hears a lot when somebody makes a promise and wants to undo a promise that they struggle a lot with guilt. And by the way, I'm going to direct you to another worksheet completely free. If you go to cruisingthroughcaregiving.com, you'll get all the worksheets for free, but it's called the Caregiver Feelings Worksheet. And it can help you to determine what your feelings are and put a label on them if you haven't been able to identify how you've been feeling. But a lot of people will say, I feel guilty. I can't live with myself if I bring my loved one to a senior living community, or if I bring help in, or if I don't do everything. One of the top mistakes that I believe that many of us make is that we think just because we feel guilty, that we are guilty. Just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you're guilty of anything. Let me explain. If you have decided to stop feeding your mom, you're not going to give her food anymore, you should feel guilty. That's very malicious. That's a bad thing to do. But if you've decided that you can't do it all anymore, that you need time to get 7 hours of sleep, that you need time to take a walk every day, that you need time to spend time with your spouse or your kids, those are not issues that that any of us should feel guilty, because we're not doing anything wrong. We just want to make sure that we're healthy and that we're feeling okay. So just because you feel guilt doesn't mean that you are guilty. If you decide to leave your loved one who has Alzheimer's home alone for a month and they're wandering all over the place and they get lost and you can't find them, that might be something to feel guilty about, because you left somebody whose brain isn't working properly unsupervised for a long period of time. But if you've decided that I'm going to bring some help in so that that's not going to happen, someone's able to see what he or she is doing, make sure that they don't walk away, that maybe take walks with my loved one so they get exercise, that's not something to feel guilty about. I want you to look at, what have you done wrong? If you feel guilty, what have you done wrong? Guilt is common. It's common in caregiving, but you have to challenge that guilt, because most of the time, a family caregiver who feels guilty, just because they feel guilty doesn't mean that they actually have done anything wrong. It's a survival. You're trying to survive this very, very difficult time in your life and in your loved one's life, and you deserve help. You deserve, not just for yourself, but your loved one. If you're doing everything, if you're giving your loved one a bath and you're giving them their medicine and driving them to the doctor and staying up all night when they have to go to the emergency room because they wandered out of the house and they fell, and you're trying to spend as much time as possible for them, and you need a break from that, that is not something that anyone should ever feel guilty about. You don't deserve to feel guilty. And I can tell you almost unequivocally, if you are on this event today, or if you're listening to this event, you probably haven't done anything to feel guilty about. Because most of the time, think about all the people that you know who are not contributing to caregiving. Maybe you have a sister in another state, a son in another town, people that you know that you feel should be helping out with caregiving for your loved one who has dementia, and they're not. A niece that never offers help. And those folks are probably not watching this event, or they're probably not participating in this event. What they're probably doing is not feeling guilty. So often I find, and I bet that Patty and Rebecca and the team at Artists can tell you, a lot of times the guilt is just so unwarranted, and it's from the people in caregiving, the family members and the loved ones who are doing the very most, that feel the very worst. Remind yourself you're doing the best that you can, and making yourself crazy, making yourself exhausted is never the answer. You have the right to undo these promises. So if you're going to undo the promise, maybe you've said to your loved one, I'll never, maybe like Nancy Reagan, you said, I'll never take you to senior living. I'll never bring help into the home. Well, actually, Nancy Reagan did allow help into the home, but I'll never bring you to senior living. If you have decided, I think senior living is going to be what makes sense, or I think adult day is what's going to be making sense for my loved one and my family, get support. There are probably going to be people who are going to judge you and tell you, oh, I can't believe it. I would never do that with my mom. I would never do that with my husband. But guess what? They might not have ever been dementia caregivers. Get support. So whether you're in a support group, and I know Artist Senior Living can provide you information about support groups, and they probably even host some. If you're in a support group, there's likely going to be people there that say, yes, absolutely, you need to undo that promise and get some help for both of you. Maybe you need to talk to a private therapist or a counselor. Maybe you need to talk about a friend who really loves you and understands how stressed out you are, and that you really need to get more help for your sanity. Decide on boundaries. What we find often, that when someone wants to undo the promise and say, If we go back to the Smith family and Christine and Joe, maybe Christine has a sister named Kathy, and Kathy doesn't do anything. Christine and Joe have been doing everything for Henry the whole time. And Kathy calls and says, "What? You're gonna bring Dad to adult day? He should be home all the time. He doesn't belong with all of those other people." Decide your boundaries. How often are you going to talk to Kathy about it? Maybe Kathy hasn't participated. Decide your boundaries. You do not deserve to take abuse from others in the family. Determine who needs to know. You might, if you're changing the way you're providing care, if you're the primary caregiver, and especially if you have power of attorney, you might not need to notify everybody in the family of every single change that you choose to make, especially if you feel that you're going to be judged by others. You're probably already judging yourself harshly, which again, remind yourself, just because you might feel some guilt does not mean you deserve to. Tell those who need to know what's going on, and those who truly need to know. If you have a sister that's very involved and she visits Dad once a week, let her know when he's going to be moving or when he's going to be at adult day, so she doesn't opt to come over during that time. But know what your boundaries are. How have things changed since Nancy's caregiver promise? Well, I'm really happy to say that a lot has changed in the way that we look at caregiving. So, for example, if you look at public figures talking about caregiving, so Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who sadly has recently been diagnosed with dementia herself, her husband had, John, I believe his name was, I believe it was Alzheimer's, was some type of dementia, and he was in senior living. She and her family placed him in senior living because she knew that that was going to be able to give him the help that he required. And not only did she place him, and her family and she made that decision, but while he was there, he forgot that he was married, and he even had a quote unquote friend or a girlfriend. And because of what was going on with his brain, the family spoke somewhat openly about the fact that they went with it. They tried to roll with it and understand and know that he wasn't trying to hurt anybody's feelings, but that his brain was just not remembering that he was married. We also see, I'm actually on the care advisory board for an organization called HFC, Hilarity for Charity, which was created by the actor Seth Rogen and his wife Lauren Miller Rogen. And Lauren Miller Rogen is in her 30s, and her mom began having young onset Alzheimer's disease when her mom was in her 50s. And they started HFC to raise money so people could have care grants, so to get home care in the home for other families. The Rogan family were able to pay for home care aides to come into the home, and they realized, hey, if there's other people that aren't in our financial position, we want to try to help them. And so they do fundraisers for in order to be able to provide care grants for families in need. The actor Kimberly Williams Paisley, she probably best known for Father of the Bride movies, and she wrote a beautiful book called Where the Light Gets In. And that book, I really enjoyed it. And I think in particular, daughters and adult kids would enjoy that book. But she talked a lot about she and her siblings and her dad's decision to place their mom into a senior living community, much like an artist senior living community, as her disease progressed. And so people are now, unlike Nancy Reagan, talking really publicly about options. And most people who have been dementia caregivers know that there is not one way to do it. There's no perfect way to be a caregiver. And yes, you might struggle with some challenging feelings, and guilt might be only one of them. Anger, worry, fear. What if something happens to my loved one? But there are so many resources now, and there are so many ways for us to be a caregiver. There's a lot of voices right now about the different ways to be a good caregiver. you aren't good to anybody. If you're keeping a promise that is making you physically sick, or your mental health is suffering, or your family relationships are suffering, it's time to revisit that promise. What do you need to change? What do you need to modify and adapt? And I know that the team at Artist Senior Living is here to talk all that through with you. But other resources, again, include the Alzheimer's Association, alz.org, support groups. And remember that, especially if you're going to change maybe a promise, or change something the way that you once did it, remember that just because you might feel some guilt, or maybe you feel a lot of guilt, I want you to assess, what have I done that I should feel guilty? And I bet you most of the time you're going to come up with, this is just me feeling bad. Is it just that you're feeling sad? Is it more sadness? Is it more unhappiness or frustration at the situation? But really challenge that guilt, because most of the time for many of you, you truly, truly don't deserve it. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I want to encourage everyone to write in with your comments and questions. And I want to invite Artist Senior Living back. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to write in. We are here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Patty, and then Darlene will wrap us up. Thank you all so very much. For a free chapter of Cruising Through Caregiving, please go to cruisingthroughcaregiving.com. And please, you will get all the worksheets that I mentioned. The survey is below. Please take that and give us any feedback that you'd like to share. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you again, Jennifer. That was a really wonderful program. And it's so nice to be here with all of you today. I wanted to just talk a little bit about how Artist Senior Living and our team here can support you now. Maybe a phone discussion about caring for a loved one with dementia is something you'd like to explore. Maybe just asking some questions or discovering what options may be available for you as you consider planning for the future. Maybe you'd like to schedule a virtual visit from the comfort of your own home and really see what we're all about and meet some of our team members on that virtual tour. And we welcome you certainly to join us for our next free educational program. And you can save the date, November 12th. We're going to be doing a program on advanced planning, a guide on how to avoid common mistakes when paying for long-term care. And that's going to be facilitated by Eric Goldberg. And we hope you can join us for that program. If you'd like to do that, always feel free to reach out to me here at Artist Senior Living. And thank you again, Jennifer. This has really just been so educational and helpful and supportive to our guests. I'll leave my number up here on the bottom. Patty Pelican, I'm the Director of Marketing, and there's my number. Thank you so much. And Darlene, I'll turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patty. And again, thank you, Artist Senior Living Chestnut Ridge, for sponsoring today. We appreciate all of you joining us. I did put a link in the chat box that is for a evaluation/survey. We'd love to get your feedback on what you thought today. So please do take a moment to copy and paste that into your browser. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you again for your time today. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.